Right now, somewhere, someone is waking up to an ordinary morning. Coffee, a shower, checking their phone, thinking about what's for lunch, what's due at work, what they forgot to do yesterday. On the morning of August 24th, in the year 79 AD, somewhere between 11,000 and 15,000 people in a small Roman city called Pompeii woke up to exactly this, an ordinary morning. Bakers were already loading bread into ovens, vendors were setting up stalls, a dog was chained outside a house, the way it was every single day. By the next morning, almost all of them would be dead or gone, not from lava. Pompeii was never touched by lava. What killed the people who stayed was something stranger, faster, and in some ways far worse than fire. And because of exactly how they died and exactly what was left behind, we now know, in extraordinary, almost unbearable detail, what most of these people were doing in the final hours of their lives. To understand what happened, you have to understand what Mount Vesuvius actually was to the people living beneath it. It wasn't a volcano to them. Vesuvius hadn't erupted in living memory. By most estimates, it had been quiet for around 800 years. To the people of Pompeii, it was just a mountain, green, terraced with vineyards, dotted with farms. Across the Bay of Naples, in a town called Misenum, a young man named Pliny the Younger was staying with his uncle, Pliny the Elder, commander of the Roman imperial fleet. Sometime around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, they noticed something rising from the mountain. A cloud, Pliny later wrote, shaped like an umbrella pine, a narrow trunk that spread out into a wide, flat canopy at the top. Today, volcanologists call that shape a Plinian column, named after the man who described it. Nobody watching it that afternoon had a name for it at all. For the first several hours, this didn't look like the end of anything. The column rose higher and higher, and then it began to fall, not as lava, but as pumice, small, light, porous stones, along with ash raining down on Pompeii continuously for hours. And here's the detail almost nobody expects. This first phase actually gave people time. As the pumice piled up, inches deep, then feet, roofs across Pompeii began to creak, then crack, then collapse under the weight. And many residents used the time that bought them. Pliny describes people in Misenum tying pillows to their heads with cloth to protect themselves from falling debris as they fled. In Pompeii, the archaeological evidence suggests a significant portion of the population, possibly more than half, left the city during this first phase, walking out through the gates while stone rained from the sky, heading inland or toward the coast. They had hours. Many of them used those hours to survive. But not everyone left. Some people decided to wait it out. Some thought the worst was already over. Some sheltered in cellars and strong rooms, believing thick stone walls would protect them, which for what was coming would not be nearly enough. And it's because of the people who stayed that we know so much about that morning. In a bakery on what's now called the Via dell'Abbondanza, archaeologists found loaves of bread still sitting inside the oven, carbonized, perfectly preserved, never taken out. In a house now called the House of Orpheus, they found a dog, still wearing its collar, still on its chain. It had been left tied up that morning, the way it probably was tied up every morning, while its owners went about their day. Nobody came back for it. These aren't symbols added afterward. These are the actual physical, preserved remains of an ordinary day, interrupted in the middle of itself. Then, sometime in the early hours of the next morning, likely around 1 in the morning, everything changed. For nearly 12 hours, the eruption column had been feeding itself on material blasted out of the mountain. But a column that tall, that violent, is unstable, and eventually it collapsed. When a Plinian column collapses, it doesn't fall back onto the mountain quietly. It collapses outward and downward all at once as what volcanologists call a pyroclastic surge. This is not lava. Lava moves slowly. You can outrun lava. A pyroclastic surge is a wall of superheated gas, ash, and rock fragments racing down the side of the mountain at speeds that can exceed 100 kilometers per hour, well over 60 miles per hour, at temperatures that, in reconstructions of this exact eruption, exceeded 300 degrees Celsius. That's hotter than a kitchen oven on its highest setting, and it arrives with almost no warning, faster than any person can run. Pompeii was hit by a series of these surges over the following hours, at least 4 according to volcanologists who have mapped the ash and rock layers left behind. And what these surges did to the people caught inside them is something modern science only fully reconstructed in 2010. A study led by volcanologist Giuseppe Mastro Lorenzo, along with bioarchaeologist Pierpaolo Petrone, analyzed the ash deposits and skeletal remains in Pompeii and concluded that for many of the people who stayed, death was not slow. It was nearly instantaneous. The extreme heat caused immediate full-body muscle contraction, something doctors call a cadaveric spasm. This is the source of the twisted, clenched postures so many of the victims were found in. For decades, those postures were described as people frozen in terror, fighting for breath. The 2010 study suggested something different. Many of these people died in a fraction of a second before their bodies had time to register pain, let alone fear. So how do we actually know any of this? The postures, the positions, the exact configuration of the moment people were caught. In 1863, an Italian archaeologist named Giuseppe Fiorelli was excavating in Pompeii when he noticed something. The volcanic ash that buried the city had hardened around the victims' bodies. Over the centuries, the bodies themselves decomposed completely, leaving behind hollow voids, cavities in the shape of exactly how each person had been positioned at the moment of death. Fiorelli's solution was simple, and it changed archaeology forever. He poured liquid plaster into these voids. When it hardened and the surrounding ash was carefully chipped away, what remained was a three-dimensional cast capturing posture, clothing folds, even the texture of fabric, frozen in the exact configuration of that final moment. One of the most famous groups of casts comes from a vineyard now called the Garden of the Fugitives. 13 people found together, including a woman still wearing her jewelry. Archaeologists call her the Ring Lady. But here's where the story gets more complicated than the popular version. Starting in the 1980s, an Australian bioarchaeologist named Estelle Laser began a detailed skeletal analysis of the Pompeii remains, and some of what she found challenged assumptions that had stood for over a century. The dramatic, frozen-in-terror postures everyone associates with the casts, many of them, Laser found, weren't necessarily preserved exactly as they were at the moment of death. Some bodies had been disturbed afterward by roof collapses, by decomposition shifting the bones, even by looters digging through the ash centuries later. Before 19th century archaeologists recast them without always knowing which bones belonged to which body. Laser's work also challenged another assumption, that the victims were mostly poor, mostly enslaved people who simply couldn't afford to flee. Her research found a genuine cross-section of Pompeii's population: men, women, children, people of different ages and apparent social classes, all caught by the same surge. There's even debate about when this happened at all. The traditional date, August 24th, comes from a single surviving transcription of Pliny's letter written roughly 25 years after the eruption. But archaeologists have found things that don't quite fit an August date. Pomegranates and other fruits typically harvested in autumn, wine vessels already sealed for fermentation, victims wearing heavier clothing than you'd expect at the height of a Roman summer. A 2008 study by volcanologist Giuliana Rolandi and colleagues argued, based on the direction the ash fell, that the eruption actually happened on October 24th, 2 months later than the date written in nearly every textbook. We're still not entirely sure. What we are sure of is this: on whatever morning it actually was, nearly 2,000 people did what people do on ordinary mornings. They baked bread, they tied up the dog, they went to work. Some of them left because they had time and they used it. Some of them stayed because nothing about that morning told them it was different from any other. And for a few terrible hours, it wasn't. Until all at once, it was.